All right, so every once in a while we get the chance to interview one of our fans or followers or contributors and get to talk to them about conservatism and what it means to them and figure out where we line up and the things that we agree on and disagree on. So today we get to do that with Hunter Moon, so I couldn't be more excited to jump into conservatism and philosophy with him. So let's get started. All right, welcome to the program, Hunter. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. How about you, sir?
Good, man. Dude, you've been with us from the beginning. We were just talking about that, how you've written essays for us, you've commented. I mean, we're always sending messages back and forth. Man, I really appreciate it. So glad we get the chance to do this and talk, on here as well.
Yeah, I've been actually wanting to do this for a while now.
Yeah, it's been fun, man. When we first started the project, it was really just my brother John and I, and we were talking, and we were like, what would be great is to have a forum to do this. And we started getting our thoughts down on paper. And then it's just been this kind of evolution and growth as we've gotten to a point now where we get to do this live. And it gives us the chance to interact with, people like yourself, and to be able to push out these videos and products and stuff and be able to explore all kinds of aspects of conservatism really on a quick pace. We get to just talk about this and go back and forth as opposed to writing just an essay and then moving on. So I love it, man. I think we're going to get into some really good stuff today. Let's jump into our first topic. So when we talk about the definition of conservatism, when we talk about the definition of conservatism, what does that mean for you? How do you define yourself? Is it as a conservative, and what do you mean by that?
Well, to me, conservatism is basically conserving the ideas, the traditions, the customs that have built up our Western civilization and its institutions, going back from ancient Greece and progressing all the way here to the modern West here in the U.S. and in Western Europe.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
No, I totally agree. And a lot of times people on my channel seem to have questions about what those are. How would you define some of those ideas loosely?
Well, I'd say that conserving the idea that the government has a duty to promote the common good while also maintaining a society with a high degree of self-governing and individual liberty. Like, in my opinion, the key debate in Western civilization going back to ancient Greece was, how do we have a society built on the idea of self-governance and individual liberty while also having a government that can make sure the common good, the general welfare of society, is protected? And I feel like conservatism is like the balance between the two, like compared to the classical liberals or libertarians who lean more towards the individual liberty side, and compared to like the fascists or monarchists or the populists who tend to go towards the common good side. Like, conservatism is basically, when it comes to both of that, is that we should protect rights that are instrumental for protecting the common good, that these rights, when used with morality and virtue, are able to protect the self-governing society and make sure the welfare of society is protected at the same time. So like freedom of speech, to speak out against tyranny, the freedom to assemble and protest against injustice, the freedom to bear arms, so that way in case the First Amendment rights fail, you have the ability to defend yourself, or even just basic procedural rights, like the government cannot take your rights without going through procedural due process.
Yeah. And I think a huge part of it is, those are complicated issues, right? You just mentioned several different perspectives on each one of them. And I think that discussion is what I see when I look back to the American founders, and I look back to really the ideas that set our country on a course for prosperity. I see a lot of debate and discussion and different opinions, and yet I see the founders coming together and agreeing on certain principles that we still honor today, right? And amongst those disagreeing parties, I see liberals, maybe, for example, Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine, definitely. I see conservatives, but that would be more like John Adams, and you could say, to an extent, George Washington. And then I see more of like the hard right, and to me that'd be Alexander Hamilton, right? And they're all in these rooms together, fiercely debating the ideas and the topics, talking about policy, and yet through that struggle able to come out with some very beautiful and awesome forms of government that are still around today and doing quite well. So when we look at that, I think of conservatism as trying to protect a lot of that discussion in that forum, right? And so for me, the ideas behind conservatism include some back and forth and debate. And yet I don't see that as much today in conservative circles. Do you?
Truth be told, it's sad that it's not seeing that, because I
Yeah.
think, like you said in that quote, the founder of conservatism argued that for progress and improvement to happen in society, you need the exchange of ideas, you need debate, you need discourse, you need people from both sides, from different perspectives, working together to find the common good and work to achieve it.
Yeah.
And heck, the modern American conservative movement was found on this idea because, as we'll talk about later with William F. Buckley, he was able to find a compromise between the Burkean conservatives like Russell Kirk, who had a high value on who valued traditional conservative social and cultural philosophy, with the libertarians like F.A. Hayek, who valued a more classical liberal approach to government and economics.
Yeah.
It was that compromise that built the modern American conservatism and ultimately led to Reagan and the modern GOP before Trump came.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, when you look at the movement that Reagan led, it wasn't lockstep. It wasn't everybody agreed on every major issue. There were libertarians who were focused on decreasing government spending. There were essentially neoconservatives who were concerned about taking on the Soviet Empire and expanding America's foreign footprint. There were traditionalists. There were social conservatives who were focused on religious liberty, right? You had this huge conglomeration of different parties, and they were able to agree on certain basic principles and the need to unite to be able to find common goals. And yet now what I see, Hunter, is I see so many conservatives very quick to write each other out of the movement. And if you don't get 110% behind what Donald Trump is doing, then you're not a conservative, and even further today, you're not a patriot. You don't love your country. And I don't think that is an American sentiment, because if that had been the belief system during the founders, we wouldn't have had agreement on the Constitution. We wouldn't have had agreement on the Bill of Rights. We wouldn't have had many of the things that we currently have. We wouldn't have had the progress and the stability that our country has enjoyed. I mean, you look at the fact that Thomas Jefferson was very much against slavery, wanted to write that into the Declaration of Independence, and he didn't get a chance to do that, and he had to compromise on that. But then, further along, he set up Abraham Lincoln to be able to take stands on that in the future. And now you have a Republican president who has been able to take that a step further. So when we see some of these compromises made, that's when we see the chance for progress over time, as long as we stick by our principles and we continue to fight for them and work with the other side to get the debate where it needs to be. So I think we agree on that, but let's look at some of the conservative sources today and kind of measure them by that discussion and see what we're talking about. So one of the ones that you and I have talked about before is Conservapedia, right? This website that puts out conservative definitions, or supposed to be conservative definitions. Let's look at that and we kind of measure it up based upon how we see it and kind of give our reaction. So I'm going to bring it up here on the screen right now. And so this is from Conservapedia, and it's their definition of a conservative, and I want to get your reaction to it. They claim that a conservative is someone who promotes moral and economic values that are beneficial to all. A conservative is willing to learn and advocate the insights of economics and the logic of the Bible for the benefit of everyone else. A conservative favors conserving value by not giving handouts to anyone who does not really need them. They talk about personal responsibility, limited government, George Washington's farewell address, that religion and morality are indispensable supports to political prosperity. And then it kind of goes on to social conservatism, leading congressmen in the House, and Ronald Reagan saying that the basis of conservatism is a desire for less government interference or less centralized authority or more individual freedom. So how do you respond to that, first of all? Do you agree with all that or disagree?
I actually have more of a mixed response, because some of those claims are actually line up with what Kirk claims, like with limited government and personal responsibility. That lines up with his idea that
Yeah.
Community should be voluntary. That decisions should be made by those who are most affected by them. So families should make family decisions.
Yeah.
Individuals should make individual decisions. Community should make community decisions as opposed to one big federal government deciding on all issues, regardless of how much it impacts the country on a federal level.
Yeah.
And also talking about personal responsibility, this also ties into why Edmund Burke and Russell Kirk were big advocates of the right to own private property, because they saw that it taught responsibility, like using your private property, whether it be a gun or something more intangible like a business, like using that for the social good, like learning how to manage it responsibly. But also, again, and also tying into limited government, as Kirk argued, the more a person controls their own property, the less an authoritarian government is able to control them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The thing is with some of these definitions is they get very quickly into the practical implications of conservatism as they get into, talking about guns, or they're talking about welfare. And it kind of misses, to me, the basics. I think a lot of times we tend to overcomplicate what conservatism is, to the point that, it's just a list of right-wing, policy proposals. Conservatism, to me, Hunter, is simply the notion that we have to conserve what exists, especially what is good that currently exists, because the world is complicated. That's it, is that we have to have a humility, and that to me is the basic conservative virtue, is that we have a humility as we go about our lives, because we don't know all the work that went into every little thing that we enjoy today. And before we change it and revolutionize or radicalize our actions, we should take a second and seek to understand what it is that we have inherited. Now, there are times where that could be a bad thing. We've inherited something like, think about segregation or slavery, or these institutions that were really evil and that needed to be discarded. There are times that we've inherited things like the Constitution that are good and that promote liberty and value in our lives, in a form of government that we can control. That's a good thing. We should not just throw that away. We should seek to understand it. And if we see a problem with it, we start to improve it and reform it. But it's this approach to everything in my life, not just government or, gun rights this or individual liberty that. It is this approach to life that says, my first instinct is to seek to understand and appreciate what's been given to me, and then to seek to reform. And that could happen over across a number of issues. So what do you make of that? Do you see that definition out there today?
Truth be told, sadly, I don't really see it. Like, if anything, I see conservatism being more defined as like owning the left at all costs, or as it's sometimes called, owning the libs. Like, there is no desire to actually, or understanding why we should conserve, say, traditional Christian morals and values. No understanding why there's a need to conserve the family. Like, they fall back on abstract ideas as opposed to actually understanding why we have to conserve this stuff.
Right. There's this ideology to it, right? And I think that Russell Kirk said it best when he called conservatism as anti-ideology, right? We are not possessed by any singular idea. We are not to the point where we are ideological and angry and hateful and spiteful towards someone else, because at the end of the day, what's been given to us is a result of barter and exchange and compromise. I mean, again, go back to the Constitution and the founders. Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Hamilton, Washington, all these guys were very different in terms of their beliefs, right? And they all had different agendas, but they came together in trying to set up this country, and they represented different parties, and they represented different, conglomerates and constituents. And as a result of working together and learning, going through the Articles of Confederation up to the Constitution, and then amending that, adding the Bill of Rights, et cetera, out of that compromise, we have something beautiful that's better if you had just had John Adams writing it by himself, right? So out of that, I see a space in America for what I would call a practical left, for a Thomas Jefferson type left, or maybe even a Thomas Paine to an extent. Of course, I don't see a space for radical socialism or communism or some of these foreign ideas that really don't have a basis in America's progress. I'm very skeptical of that. But when it comes to your more moderate liberals, I'm not going to agree with them on a whole lot, especially things like abortion and gun rights and all that kind of stuff, or extreme welfare programs that haven't been tested, etc. But I am going to make space for them because I can recognize that what has been given to us is a good thing and a result of that compromise. That doesn't mean I agree, but it means I'm going to hear them out, right? And I like you were saying, I feel like that is extremely rare to the point of ideology. And if people believe that, that's fine. But I don't think it's conservative. And I want to show you this. This is from our website. So if you go on theburkingconservative.com, you go to the About page, you'll see how we define conservatism. And we say that a Burkean conservative is a person who ascribes to the conservative political philosophy in the tradition of Edmund Burke. So I think you've read a little bit of Burke. You seem pretty smart on a lot of his ideas. So we have some of that on our page, but could you describe that for some folks of what makes a Burkean conservative? What makes someone who follows the tradition of Edmund Burke?
Well, to put it simply, it's practicing what has been tried and successful as opposed to embracing change for the sake of change. Like Edmund Burke, the whole reason he wrote the Reflections on the Revolution of France, which was laid out the principles of conservatism, was it was a response to the radical abstract liberalism of the French revolutionaries, warning that yes, the French institutions may have some, like the monarchy or the Catholic Church may have some corruption in them. They have been essential to the welfare and progress of France, and that we should be careful before the French should be careful before just throwing them away.
Right.
Like I think the analogy he used was as a glorious castle that has fallen into disrepair, and he advocates for rather than tearing down the castle, we should work to restore the glory of this castle and make it better. And he contrasted the French Revolution to the Glorious Revolution that England underwent in 1688, where he argued we had this revolution, but instead of overthrowing society, we reformed it to make it better in accordance with our pre-existing principles and values.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Burke did this thing where he could see the difference in people talking about liberty and the fact that everybody was using this word liberty, and yet they had different meanings. And the way that Americans saw liberty is they saw themselves as trying to protect the history and the inheritance that they had been given and all the work that had gone into making the colonies, prosperous in the New World. They had inherited their beliefs about government largely from England itself, and they were simply trying to practice that and promote religious freedom. And then here comes England increasing all their taxes and trying to push them down, the Stamp Act, et cetera, et cetera. And Burke is looking at that saying, the Americans are not fighting us. They are simply trying to live their lives. What are we doing? They're practicing liberty in a good way. And then he saw the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins, who were using the same word of liberty, but they meant kill everyone who is part of the aristocracy, kill the king, kill his family, kill the children, and let's have a revolution to the point that anyone who is disagreeing with us and is not a part of our movement gets killed. And that's the reign of terror that led eventually to dictatorship and Napoleon Bonaparte. And Burke could see the difference because in America, they were trying to protect and preserve much of what they had done and earned and inherited. And in France, they were trying to eradicate every part of society that they chose not to agree with. And there was such a difference in that. And that goes back to what we were just saying about a conservative philosophy that's bigger than any particular agenda, be it right-wing or not, or any particular practical issue, right? And so I think that philosophy can help us. Now, now Burke, of course, we're talking 18th century, right? So it's been a couple hundred years, and it's easy to say like, oh, he's old news, and why should I read some philosopher that's ancient, and how is he going to help me today? But in terms of more modern folks, when we think of people in the past, say, 50 years, I mean, you mentioned Reagan. Who would you look at to say, hey, this is someone who inspires me to some extent, Burkean or otherwise?
I'd probably have to go with, it's probably cliche, but Reagan, yes, he was seen by some as very far right, a super strong laissez-faire capitalist, a very strong social conservative. But the thing is, in my opinion, he embraces what the ideal American politician should be. Someone who's able to promote compromise, promote unity. He got a lot of his programs done
Yeah.
with a Democrat-controlled House of Representatives because he was able to work with them, promote compromise.
Yeah.
Like again, how our country was founded was on compromise
Yeah.
and
I
working
mean,
together.
I agree. He was able to sit down with Gorbachev and the Soviets and be able to, bring them to the table. And he had this policy of peace through strength, and promoted enough national defense spending to intimidate the Soviets. And yet he was able to sit down and talk with them and avoid a war. He was able to work with Democrats in the House, like you mentioned, Tip O'Neill and the rest. I would also mention Buckley, right? So, someone that we've talked about is William F. Buckley, is someone who was able to bring together these different movements. So I want to bring him up too, and we were talking about Conservapedia, right? So let's take a look at how they actually consider Buckley. So I just brought up their page now, and we can look at it. And they talk about William F. Buckley Jr., and they have the years that he lived. They call him a prominent conservative and globalist, an author and commentator during the second half of the 20th century, best known for founding the National Review, which rarely addressed social issues, is what they say. He also hosted Firing Line, his show, a talk show that featured for years on the otherwise liberal public television channel PBS. Conservapedia claims that Buckley was admired on both sides of the political spectrum for his seemingly limitless vocabulary and his intellectual wit, but he was not a grassroots activist and had no outstanding political achievements. Buckley also led the intense liberal smear of the John Birch Society, which was his more conservative competitor in the 1960s. So what do you make of that? That's kind of different than what I just said in terms of him being an example of an inspiring conservative. But what do you make of it, Hunter?
Well, as to he had no major political achievements, I'd argue that's completely incorrect because, as I mentioned at the start of this discussion, he was able to help foster compromise between the neoconservatives, the traditionalist conservatives, and the classical liberals like Hayek, being able to find a common ground so that they could unite to fight the New Deal liberalism and communism abroad.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And also, he was the one who inspired Reagan to run and inspired Reagan's beliefs and platforms. So to say that he had no political achievements is, in my opinion, completely historically inaccurate.
Yeah, I totally agree. It also says Buckley's political views do not represent the future of the conservative movement as much as its past, as he did not speak out enough about the big social issues that would dominate the future of politics, and talks about the ERA, talks about pro-life and abortion, et cetera, et cetera. There's also this other part we can talk about where, talking about the John Birch Society, some people might not know who that is, so you have to explain it, but this is also part of the same definition. It says, in apparent appeasement of the liberal media, beginning in the mid-1960s, Buckley embarked on a smear campaign against the John Birch Society. Buckley hosted a show on public television called Firing Line and used that to discredit the JBS, as he did at 30 and again at 31 minutes after the hour on December 1, 1966 interview. Right? I think this was written by the John Birch Society. How about you?
Yeah, it really felt that way. Like, if you look at Conservapedia's other articles, you could tell this person sounds like some far-right conspiracy theorist and a paleocon in terms of their political views.
So who is the John Birch Society, just to explain it to folks?
Okay, so the John Birch Society was founded in the 1950s. It was named after a U.S. sniper who was killed helping the Chinese fight off the communists there, which unfortunately the communists eventually won.
Yeah.
But anyway, their big platform was they were pretty much complete far right. Like, they were pretty much like the alt-right before the alt-right. Like, they opposed the civil rights movement. They opposed increased rights for women in the workplace and society within marriage. And that's ultimately why, and they also were conspiracy theorists. Like, they had this conspiracy that the government was being controlled by some communist conspiracy trying to undermine America. And that's ultimately why Buckley chastised them, because he saw these radicals, these trying to think these backwards, in a way backwards thinking people as being detrimental to conservatism.
Yeah. I agree. And so, like you said, it's kind of the alt-right before there was an alt-right. And you can see how they treat Buckley as saying he's part of the past and he didn't represent the future and he didn't talk enough about social issues, and almost discrediting him when they're supposed to be defining him in this article. So immediately it's a smear campaign. And you know, Hunter, that's the opposite of what I try to do with this channel. We've had a libertarian presidential candidate on. We've had conservative authors on that are very much pro-Trump. We've had Democrats on that would describe themselves as center-left. We've had plenty of conservatives like ourselves on. And what I try to do with each one is try to understand their worldview, and then I try to find some type of agreement in it based upon an authentic conservatism. And I'll challenge them whenever it gets to a point that I really don't agree. But at the same time, what I'm not going to do is completely dismiss or discredit them before I've heard them out. And I really think that's what's been lost in conservatism today, is we have to recover this cooperation to say, okay, you're a libertarian. That's great. We may not agree on, exactly how much government should exist. You may be a little more radical than me in terms of shutting down all kinds of government programs. But let's find some common ground. Let's find some issues that we can cooperate on and mutually respect each other. And then we get to a point of, I had a Democrat, right? I had a liberal on our show a couple weeks ago who was against Bernie Sanders. He was like, I am not feeling the Bernie train. I'm not a Bernie bro. And I'm like, awesome. Neither am I. Like, we can agree on that. We may not agree on Hillary Clinton. You may support her and I don't. But at least we can agree that socialism is not good for this country. And let's focus on that first. And then we can get to all the different points that we disagree, because I'm sure there's a lot, right? As we have to figure out how to build coalitions again. And I think I totally agree with you that Buckley did that. I think that Burke did that. He took on all kinds of issues. And I think that our American founders did that. And what I really don't have a lot of time for is someone who comes on our page and just, throws out a single word, stupid, or you're dumb, or, you have a liberal, that's crazy. And then they leave and they don't spend any time actually engaging with other people who think differently. Then we cannot get to this point where conservatism becomes anti-intellectual, and I fear we're headed that way. So, man, I appreciate you being on the channel. I'm glad we got the chance to have this talk and stuff. I really would love to have you on there. There's so much more to talk about. No, I appreciate everything that you've done and helped us out with the channel as we've gone along through this. But if we were to do another session, what would you like to talk about?
I like to talk about the American conservative, Pat Buchanan, because I feel like that offers a view into the descent within the conservatism from the mainstream, Reagan conservatism that has dominated the last, I'd say, like 30 years of the American conservatism.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we can do that next time. So we'll definitely put a pin in it for now. But yeah, we'll talk about that next time. We can also talk about, what's going on today with all the protests and all that's happening right now, and a lot of the vitriolic environment, and how we navigate out of that without appeasing too much, the left and stuff. So I think that I'd love to get your opinions on that for the future. So thanks again for your time, man. Really appreciate having you on the show, and look forward to continued discussions with you, buddy.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.